Hey everyone, welcome to the last video of the series. Sorry this took so long. This stuff doesn't come easy for me, but I love doing it, and I hope these videos are of some use to you. Before getting into it, let's contextualize Chapter 3 a little. In Chapter 3, The Organization of Conscious States, Free Will, Bergson will take the ideas laid out in Chapter 1 and 2 and see how they relate to the topic of free will. The distinction between the inner world of consciousness and the extended material world made in the previous chapters will help us notice some of the presuppositions embedded in the problem of free will. Bergson states that the arguments for determinism, and I quote, rest on an inaccurate conception of the multiplicity of conscious states, or rather, of duration. Thus, in light of the principles worked out in the foregoing chapter, we shall see a self emerge whose activity cannot be compared to that of any other force. One of Bergson's first moves is to give us an account of the two major types of determinism and see if one doesn't rely on the other. The central idea of determinism in both of these schools of thought is that events are necessitated by their antecedents. I'll use the term necessitate or necessity often throughout this video to describe a relationship between cause and effect in which the effect of the cause could not have been any other way. In other words, to say that an event was necessitated is to say that it was fatally determined by whatever preceded it. Throughout history, there have been two main ways in which human life has been conceived of as being necessitated or determined. These types of determinisms are referred to by Bergson as physical determinism and psychological determinism. So what is physical determinism? Physical determinism is the idea that conscious states, or our experience itself, is determined by the physical world. In this view, the nervous system receives excitations from the world and necessitates our conscious experience. This idea often leads to the conclusion that consciousness in some mysterious way emerges from our brains, and that what we feel and think is necessitated by our brains. It is undeniable that our brains and conscious states have some sort of relationship, but the nature of that relationship is still up for debate. Bergson admits that some sensory perception does seem to be more or less determined by a cause. For example, a specific frequency of light will determine what color appears to us. We're not free to choose the color in which an object will appear, but to leap from these superficial instances of our simplest perceptions being determined to the idea that our deepest conscious states are fatally determined by our brains is to have already decided on determinism. Now you might be thinking, isn't it true that we have a greater understanding of the brain and how it correlates to conscious experience than we did in Bergson's time? This is of course true, but even so, we have yet to prove that brains necessitate conscious experience. Furthermore, we still don't understand how a collection of neurons could give rise to an experience in the first place. The problem is so perplexing that it has literally been coined the hard problem. So why is it so popular to interpret the relationship of the brain and consciousness as the brain giving rise to and determining our conscious states? Bergson rightly acknowledges that to interpret these relations between the physical world and consciousness as ones of necessity is to have already decided for psychological reasons on the idea of determinism. It seems as though there are two main psychological factors that influence our preemptive belief in physical determinism. The mind obsessed with quantifying has an unconscious desire to extend the deterministic laws of the material world to include all phenomena, including conscious experience. And secondly, when we reflect on our conscious experience, it appears and can strongly feel as though we are determined. Because it is these psychological realities that give rise to our belief in physical determinism, it is here, in the domain of psychology, that our attention will be directed. This leads us to the idea of psychological determinism. Psychological determinism is the idea that conscious states are necessitated by their antecedent states. The psychological determinist says, okay, Let's forget about brains and all that stuff and reflect on our experience. And upon reflecting, it is quite true that our actions can be explained by antecedent states. For example, you may ask yourself, why are you thinking about philosophical ideas right now? And the answer would of course be that is because you're currently experiencing a video on philosophy. In most cases, if you ask yourself why you acted a certain way or thought of a certain thing, you can explain it by relating it to a preceding state. For various reasons we'll discuss later, the psychological determinists will interpret this as a relation of necessity. But even the person who is convinced of determinism has an unshakable sense of freedom in immediate experience. No matter the conclusions we have arrived at through logic or reason, immediate experience itself, prior to reflection, gives us a sense of freedom. This sense is so prevailing that even some of today's most hardcore determinists, like Sam Harris, admit that in immediate experience they have a feeling of freedom. Whether we are free or not, we can argue that the idea of psychological determinism doesn't arise from our immediate experience, but must be rooted in how we reflect on our experience. It is here, in the way we think about experience, that deterministic beliefs arise. Let's look at the claim of psychological determinism. The psychological determinist argues that conscious states are necessitated by preceding states. If you have been following this series, this statement might have a special ring to it, as it relies on the idea that conscious states are discrete packages that precede one another. As we discovered in the last video, to think of conscious states in this way is to think of our states as extended. This results from the fact that when we reflect on our experience or compress the complexity of inner life to a single word, we are forced to isolate states and organize them as if they were objects in space. The important thing to remember here is that when we do this, we are mistranslating our experience. The psychological determinist has forgotten this and sees nothing wrong in treating conscious states as if they were objects in space. It is no surprise, then, that if one attributes conscious states with the properties of matter, that they will also believe these states to be subject to the same deterministic laws that appear to govern the material world. The idea that the same cause will produce the same effect is at the heart of determinism, for if it didn't, a system would be by definition indeterminate. But what does the idea of cause and effect look like if we consider the moments of experience as they really are, interpenetrating and interior to one another? The idea of the same cause producing the same effect makes no sense in the domain of duration. In space, we can demonstrate that the same cause produces the same effect, but in conscious experience, we cannot, because we can't experience the same thing twice. This is one of the many profound observations that Bergson makes that opens us up to the radical novelty and richness of inner life. Remember that duration implies that the past is not separate from the present, but contracted within it. This entails that any so-called isolated experience that we have is not in fact isolated, but fused with the entirety of our conscious existence. I'll try to elucidate this through a metaphor. Imagine a cup of water. As we drop various colors of paint into the water, we see changes in the liquid. At one moment, we drop ultramarine blue into the cup and see a greenish tinge in the water. After dropping some other colors in the cup, we decide to drop the exact same amount of that ultramarine blue in the cup, as we did before. Yet this time, we see the water shift towards purple. Because the paint accumulates and mixes, we see the same causes, the paint drops, producing different effects, the way in which the water appears. This is of course just a metaphor, and has some spatial implications that we should be careful about, so don't take it too literally. The point is to illustrate that in the domain of consciousness, where there is only accumulation with interpenetration, the same will never be the same. Experience accumulates, and in this very accumulation, it is in a perpetual state of transformation. That is why the single hit of a drum repeated evolves into a rhythmic experience, or the quiet dripping of your faucet evolves into excruciating frustration and anger. So far, we have argued that the realm of consciousness is radically non-spatial, and thus it is unintelligible to apply the properties of extension to it. But where does this leave freedom? Let's further analyze the determinist position to see how our theory of duration contrasts their view and opens up the possibility of freedom. The determinist who ignores the non-spatial and qualitative reality of conscious experience will be led to see the self as an aggregate of discrete states, like feelings, desires, motives, etc. As a result, they will formulate human action in terms of the dominance of one state over the rest. For instance, they might say that if we eat dessert, it is because our desire to enjoy a piece of cake was stronger than our desire to remain on our diet. They will then exclaim that our desire to enjoy the cake determined our behavior. Bergson here omits levels of freedom. He acknowledges that as we move towards the outer shell of the self, that is pointed towards social engagements, conscious states appear to be more separate and do not resonate with the entirety of our soul. In this sense, the more superficial our actions, the more determined they are. On the other hand, when we are faced with situations that stir the depths of the deep-seated self, we can no longer think of states as isolated from each other. The deep self is not composed of separate states, but is an ever-becoming qualitative whole. With this view of consciousness, we cannot accredit an action to one state over another without admitting that we are self-determined, for in each state exists the entirety of ourselves. In this sense, Bergson quite beautifully sees the free act as an expression of the entire self. This self doesn't oscillate between possible decisions, remaining unchanged until one factor overrides another, but is radically dynamic, always becoming in creative and spontaneous growth. Okay, but the question, are we free to choose how we grow, will no doubt be raised in response to this idea of freedom. But to ask such a question is again to divide the self into component parts in some kind of abstraction. For Bergson, there is no difference between choosing how to become and the free and spontaneous expression of becoming itself. We're still left with one task. How can the free act, which is not merely a psychological movement, but a movement in space, break the chain of necessity we see prevail in the external world? As we just discussed, freedom often gets defined as the ability to choose between two options, or associated with intelligence and control. But Bergson will warn us of thinking in these ways, as these ideas lead us to confuse experience with space. For Bergson, freedom has nothing to do with this and everything to do with memory, or the accumulation of the past. In this sense, it might be more clear to think of Bergson's freedom as a force specific to consciousness that cannot be compared to any other force. This is about as close as we can get to giving any definition of freedom, for to cognitively grasp it is to mistranslate it into a static idea, which will make it seem as though we are determined. Freedom is not a thing, but a process, and there is no way to know a process other than to live it out. Anyway, back to the idea of the thickness of duration as the locus of this force. Everybody is familiar with the bong-smoking philosophical observation that it's always now, man, time doesn't exist. This profound and technically rigorous claim arises from the fact that the past is not external to the present, but contracted within it, and that duration is not a series of points on a line, but an ever-becoming unity. Our present has the thickness of duration, but just as we have a tendency of representing our experience in space, so should we be careful not to attribute space with the properties of experience. While the present is rich and thick with duration for the enduring subject, the external present, out there in the inanimate world, is infinitely thin. Objects in space only ever occupy a single position. They retain nothing of the past in the present. They don't endure. Time has no residue in space. It is neither a gain or a loss for a physical system, but for us, it accumulates and thus could be considered a gain. From this gain, novelty is made possible. As conscious beings that store up duration, we exert a force on a system that cannot be accounted for by that system. Our action thus breaks the chain of necessity and adds something truly new to the world. As indicated in the title of Bergson's next major work, Matter and Memory, he will elaborate on this relationship between matter and memory, in an attempt to reconcile the issues that arise between the dualist opposition of mind and matter. Thanks for listening. My next project will be to reread Matter and Memory. If I feel I understand it well enough, maybe I'll make some videos on that book too, but that won't be for some time. So we'll see. Until next time, see you guys later.